Okay, we're back with a small but dedicated group of students. Thank you for sticking around. I think it's kind of an important lesson because we're going to start to, awesome, that's great, Matt. We're going to start to work with MongoDB. Um, so I'm going to go through just a quick kind of look at Mongo in more detail. These slides are here for you. It's this item on Blackboard, getting started with MongoDB and Mongoose for you to reference. So here's what our sort of traditional tables, MySQL SQL Server looked like, right? We have tables with columns, and it looks like a grid when we kind of visualize our data. And we would use some kind of tool, like in ASP.NET, we used Entity Framework to map our objects and our relationships. And part of the challenge is this is really inflexible, right? What happens when we have an existing database and then suddenly we need to add a new field? Our customer says, I want a new input in my form. So you have to go back to the database. We've got to re-engineer. We've got to consider any SQL queries that affect that table. So it's not very flexible. So in NoSQL, we're just storing JSON documents. So everything is just a key value pair. Everyone's familiar with JSON format. So we talked about some of the benefits. I won't go over all of this. We do not have things like joins or foreign keys. So there's a couple of ways we can relate different data. So we don't really use the term tables and records anymore. We use the terms collections and documents. So here, for example, this would be a restaurant document. And you'll notice a few things. In MongoDB, automatically every document gets a unique identifier that will be called _ID. And it will look kind of like a GUID generated in the Microsoft world. So you don't have to do anything. As soon as you save a document to MongoDB, it will automatically give it a unique identifier. But then you'll notice that the address, rather than having a single value, the address is another JSON object that has its own set of keys and values. So we can nest data inside other data in a MongoDB document. It's just a JSON file, basically. And also here, we've got an array of grades where the restaurant has been scored on different dates. So how do we deal with relational data? There's a couple of ways we can do it. In a relational database, it's simple, right? We create a primary key and a foreign key, and we set up a foreign key constraint where there's a one-to-many relationship. So for example, we might have employers and jobs as different tables, and every job has an employer ID as a foreign key, right? We create a job, we pick the employer, they're tied together. In MongoDB, we can do this. We could create an employers collection and a jobs collection, and we could have a field in here called, employer ID that would relate them. So it's not a constraint, though. In a relational database, you could not create a job without an employer. MongoDB, remember, it's schemaless, so we could do that. The other option is just to nest the data inside, like this. So we could have an employer's collection, and we could just put the jobs underneath each employer. So inside of the employer document, we just post the jobs. So you can do either, and kind of the way you decide is how many child records do we think there are? So if there's going to be lots and lots of them, like on Skip the Dishes, for example, we probably wouldn't want to nest the orders inside of a restaurant document, because a restaurant over time might get thousands and thousands and thousands of orders. So we're probably better to have a restaurants collection over here and an orders collection over here, and we would relate each order is from one restaurant. But in something like our job tracker, we might choose to use just a single collection, a single employers collection, and we'll just nest the jobs inside, because we're probably not going to have millions and millions of jobs posted by one employer. And there's a link here that kind of describes making that decision. So there's no rules with MongoDB, it's guidelines. right? So if it's a few child records, we're probably going to nest them inside the parent document. This also makes, Ralph, you mentioned the queries, that we don't need joins and they're really fast. That's great because it means if we nest the data, we can go and get an employer and all their jobs in a single fetch from the database. We don't have to look in different places with the join, connect things together. That makes things slow. So MongoDB, it's actually been around. It might be new, seem new for you guys. It's actually been around for 15 years now, and it comes from the word humongous. So they took the word Mongo out of the middle, and that's where the name came from. The idea was we could build really, really large databases. And the data is stored as binary JSON, so keys and values, but it's converted to ones and zeros, which makes it even faster. And everything is just native JavaScript, supported by a lot of the hosts. And we said we didn't use SQL for queries, so it would just be something like this. Similar to what we did in our ASP.NET controllers, we would just take our collection and call find. And if we wanted to pass in like a where clause, that's just passed in as a JSON object. So we're working with JSON all the time. So what we're going to do is MongoDB has a free cloud service. They give us 0.5 terabyte of storage. We can create one database. We can put as many collections as we want in there. And then there's also a tool called Mongodb Compass that we're going to download. It's a GUI tool for looking at our databases. So we can use the web portal or we can use Compass. Compass is like a scaled down version of like MySQL Workbench or SQL Server Management Studio. So it lets us connect to and view the data in our database. Or we can do it directly right in the MongoDB cloud portal. So we're going to go and get set up. So first of all, I want you to go to mongodb.com. And you're going to sign up for free. They will send you, much like Heroku did, they'll send you a verification email. I'm going to pause the recording. Give me a thumbs up when you have successfully registered and logged into your account. If you're watching the video later, then make sure you do this. Because all our subsequent lessons are going to require you to have this database access. So you will get prompted what kind of application. You can pick anything. I think Ralph's suggestion was a good one, to just pick other and put in web app, and you can leave JavaScript as the option. So I'm in here. I'm going to choose build a database. It's going to give me a screen that looks like this, deploy a cloud database. And we want to make sure that we are not paying. So make sure you click on over on the right. The third column said free shared. We want the free one. So Heroku will recommend a provider, either Amazon Web Services, Google Cloud, or Azure. And some of these, a lot of these are paid, but this one that it sort of defaults to in the Western US, if I just leave all of these selections, this will give me 512 megabytes. Sorry, I said gigabytes before. So give me 0.5 gig of free storage, and the account should say M0 Sandbox. So all I did was click free shared. I'm not changing any of the other options. And then it says cluster name. So the cluster is actually the database itself. It defaults to the name cluster 0. I'm just going to change that. I'll change the name to Comp2106, but it doesn't really matter. And you cannot rename the database. So our cluster is our database. We are allowed to create one free database. So everything we're going to do in this course will have to be in this one database. And then I'll just click the green create cluster, make sure it says free, free forever. So I will click create cluster. And then it wants us to create a user, which we can then use these credentials in our Node application. So we'll want to create a username and password and put these in a file somewhere. Yeah, it doesn't matter. You can use the same name. It's fine because we're on different servers. So yes, Chris, it doesn't matter if we have the okay, so I'm going to create a user that's also called Comp2106, and I'll just give it a password. And it's going to take a few minutes to provision our cluster. Now, we have the ability to set up and install MongoDB on our local computers as well for free. But I find it's easier to use the cloud service. That's the name. This name Atlas means their cloud version, because that way we can deploy our application to Heroku. If we have a local database, our site is going to run locally. But as soon as we deploy it to the internet, right, the database is local, so our database isn't going to work. I would probably avoid special characters in that case. If you're getting that warning, Chris, I don't know. It might be fine, but it might create headaches down the road. So I'd recommend you, with that warning, you may want to just leave special characters out. So we'll have to let this run for a couple minutes. So there is a desktop client we can use to connect and view our databases. I'll show you where that is. You don't have to use it. I will probably just use the web portal instead to view, so that we can do things like look at the data in the database, for example. If you want it, I will post a link and show you where it is, as that's running. So if you want that tool, you can experiment with it. It's called Compass. Again, it's like Management Studio we work with last semester, or Workbench that we used last year. It will run on any platform. So this is a desktop application. If you want to, I'm not going to use it. I have it on my computer. I'm probably not going to use it, but you can download it if you want it. It isn't necessary. We can just use the web-based database portal as well. But if you want it, the link I will put in the chat, and you're free to use. Okay, so as that provisions, let's talk a little bit about Mongoose. So in the slides, I've put these steps here on Blackboard. So make sure you use the free sandbox and you create your user account. So I want to talk a little bit about Mongoose. So Mongoose is an NPM package we're going to install in our job tracker. It functions much like the entity framework functioned in the ASP.NET world, or like the PDO library functions in the PHP world. It's an interface that lets our web application talk to the database. So we'll install Mongoose, and then we will use Mongoose in our application to connect to the database. Our connection string is going to look something like this. We'll be able to grab it from the MongoDB portal, and then we can create a model using Mongoose. So what Mongoose allows us to do is to make models in our Node application, but without requiring us to have any matching schema in the database. Okay, so it's a little more flexible. And then our model will have built-in methods for doing create, read, update, and delete that we can try. So let's see if we're done. Still provisioning, that's okay. So let's make sure we've got our application open. So we'll open up our job tracker locally. And I'm going to open up my terminal so that we can install Mongoose in the project. So we'll do npm I Mongoose. And that will install the Mongoose package. So now we can use Mongoose to connect our web application to the MongoDB, our MongoDB cluster that is still running. That's okay, we don't need the database yet. We now have some work we can start to do in our web project. So go ahead and install Mongoose. It should install quite quickly. And if we look at our folder structure, we've got 2/3 of the MVC structure, right? We've got controllers and we've got views, but there is no folder for models. So I want to create a model folder, and we want to build a simple employer model, which we might evolve over the next few classes. So I'm going to make a new folder in my root. So I don't want it there. So I'm going to go to my root and make a new folder called models, all lowercase, plural with an S on the end. And then I want to make a JavaScript file for an employer model. And our models in Node, they are singular, just like they were singular when we created our model names in ASP.NET. So I'm going to right-click my new model folder. I'm going to make a new file, which I will call employer singular.js. So in our controllers, we've got employers plural, and inside of models, I now have employer singular. So we're going to now require Mongoose, the package we just installed. And now we're going to use Mongoose to create a schema. So this will look fairly similar to when we created model classes in ASP.NET, right? If we wanted an employer, we defined what were the properties and data types. Now, when we were working with ASP.NET, we had to create that schema both in our web application, and then we used a migration tool to copy that schema to the database. We don't even really need to do that second step with Mongoose. So we'll say let employer schema equals a new mongoose.schema. And then we're just going to use JSON formatting to define, so what information should we capture about employers? Again, we don't need to create the schema in the database, but we do need to define that schema in our model class. So we've got a job tracker. We want to track employers and jobs. So what should an employer look like? What information do we want to capture and display about each employer? Do you think we're going to wind up building an employer form? Okay, yep, we'll want a name. Okay. And we'll define that as a string. Actually, I'm going to make this its own JSON object. So our type string and our required we'll have a validator built right in. And we'll say trim is true. So we want to remove spaces at the beginning and end of the name. Okay, so we'll have a name. Yep, I think we'll want a location. Okay? Yep. So every employer is going to have a name and a location. Anything else? So we're going to use this site together to list, companies in the area, employers in the area that you guys might want to check out for jobs. Is there anything else about an employer you would want to know besides their name and where they are? What other information would be useful to you? Like, we're not going to make up fake employers. We're going to put real companies in here. If I said, okay, yeah, so maybe something like, or at least services, or maybe we want some kind of description. Yeah, and a URL would be a good idea, right? So like, what does the company do, or what technologies do they specialize in? Like, are they an ASP.NET shop? Are they a design firm? So let's put in string. We'll say maybe the description isn't required. Yeah, maybe we want, I think that's a good idea. If we can, it would be useful to have their website. So again, we won't make it required, but if we know their website, let's put it in. Okay, so we can add to this schema later. Later on, we'll maybe include a subarray for jobs, so we can post individual jobs within the employer schema. And then lastly, remember, we want to make this public so the controller can use it for CRUD. So we're going to export our model. We are exporting it as a Mongoose model with the name of employer. So this is the public name that we can use to reference it in our other files. Okay, so there's our model class. So fairly similar. We're just using JavaScript and JSON format, but not really all that different from the model classes that we built in ASP.NET. Right, we gave it a name, a schema. We defined the properties of our model and our data types and any validation rules, and then we exported it. We made it public in Pascal case, so starting with a capital and it's singular. So you don't have to create model classes for your portfolio, but you will in your next assignment. Okay, are there any questions about our model class? I would think it should be fairly straightforward because creating models is not new for you. We may come back and we may modify this a little bit later. That's fine. Let's see if our database is done. I'm kind of surprised. I'm just going to check whether it's actually done. Okay, yeah, I think this is telling me my cluster is still provisioning, but if I click on databases under deployment, it's here. So I think it's running. So I'm just going to go to NPM and pull up the Mongoose documentation for a moment. We want to add in our app.js, we want to add a connection to our database. So if we look in the Mongoose documentation, it tells us install Mongoose. Okay, we've done that. And then we want to import it in our app.js. And then we should be able to use Mongoose. The library has a method called connect. And then we would pass in our connection string. So let's try this out and see if we can connect to our database when our node application starts. So I'm going to go to app.js. And I'm going to do this after, it's got to go after here. We want to create the Express application first. That's on line 12. So this is our Mongoose DB connection. So we're going to require Mongoose, first of all. And we will try to connect. Now our connection string will go here. We'll have to grab that in a minute from the MongoDB portal. So we're going to try to connect, and then we're going to evaluate the response. So when Mongoose tries to connect, it's going to give us back some kind of response. And then we can print out one of two messages. If we have a response, we'll say we connected, and if we don't, we can print an error message to the console. So if we get a response, we'll say connected to MongoDB. And if not, we'll catch MongoDB connection failed. Now, right now, this is going to fail because we don't have a connection string here. So we will grab this in a minute, but I'm going to try this out. I should get an error. We should get an error in the console saying MongoDB connection failed because our connection string is missing. We're going to have to grab it and paste it in. But I'm going to save this and try it. I'll go to my terminal. So here's our new code. I'll clear my console, and now I will just use NodeMon to try and start the app. And it tells me, hey, okay, connection failed. So our connection string, we can actually go and grab now from the MongoDB cloud panel, from their dashboard. And we're going to paste it in right here. So if you go back to your database, so if you click on under deployment and databases, here's my new database. If I click, there's a button here that says connect and wants me to choose. I'm going to choose this one that says connect your application. This is going to give me the connection string. So here is the database connection string we're going to paste in, but notice there's placeholders for username and password. It doesn't print them. Okay, I'll go back to show you again how I got here. Under deployment, I click databases. And it should take me to a page that says database deployments. Here's the database cluster I made. And then I have a connect button right beside the name of the database. So we'll click on connect. I'm going to choose the second option. I want to connect my application. And then I've got a little copy button right here. And it'll tell them, it says we just have to replace the password, including the angled brackets, and the username in the connection string. So I'll copy that. I get a check mark saying it's on my clipboard. I'm going to paste it in right in here, in between my single quote in the mongo.connect. And then I've got to replace this angled bracket username and angled bracket password. I need to put in the credentials. So I'll keep mine simple. Comp2106 winter. There was my password. So I'm going to save this, again, to make sure you take out the angled brackets. put in your username and password, and then I'm going to save my file. NodeMon should restart my application, and we'll see now whether it connects or fails. I'll hit Control S, my app restarts, and it tells me now I am connected to MongoDB. Now yours may fail. Let me know if it passes or fails once you put in your username and password. Matt, yours worked, okay? So this means our Node application should be able to talk to MongoDB now. Okay, that's good, Colton. Now, for now, I've just hard-coded the connection string right in our app.js. This is not ideal. We'll keep it here for now, but we're going to want to move it into a configuration file later. Okay, so I'll just show you that one more time. So in your database deployment, you click the connect button. We choose connect your application. We copy the connection string. We paste it into our mongoose.connect parameter inside of those two single quotes we had earlier. And then I just replace the placeholders for username and password with the credentials that I set up. So we're going to do one more thing with this. We're going to, for today, we're going to manually create some employer records in the database. We'll just insert them. And then we can modify our employer page to actually fetch them from the database. So in our controller, our employer's controller, right now, we've just hard-coded this list. So we're going to get rid of this list, and our controller is going to use our employer model to fetch the employers from MongoDB and then display them in the database. Sorry, display them in our website. So in the MongoDB panel, we can actually manually create some data here. So I clicked on this connect button before. 2 buttons to the right, there's this browse collections button. So this is going to show us what's in here. Okay, and it says, okay, you have no collection. This is a brand new database. So there's a white button here that says add my own data. Let's click on that. So our database name is going to be the same as my cluster name. And it wants us to create our first collection, which we will call, all in lowercase, we'll call it employers. Okay, so we're creating a database called Comp2106, and we're creating an empty collection. And then just click on the green create button. So we've now got the ability to add some documents here. So I'm going to go and insert a document into my employer's collection. So this is just going to be JSON. And maybe I'll put in a name. Anybody want to list a company that we should put in our database? Maybe a place you worked on co-op or you've applied to for a job. What's the company name and where are they located? Okay, so Gooder Marketing, which is owned by Ryan, who is a graduate of the program. So I'm going to type in name and Gooder Marketing here. And then if I hit the 2, it turns into a little plus sign. And then it says you can add a new field after the name. So I'll put in location as Barry. I'm going to leave the description and the website out for now. We can put those in later. Okay, so I've got a simple JSON document with the name of Gooder Marketing, the location of Barry. I'll just insert my document. So now it generates this object ID, and I've got a name and location. I'm then going to insert another document. I actually drove by Media Suite yesterday, down in South Barry. So I'm going to insert one more. We'll call it, the name is Media Suite. And again, I'll add a location. From now, I'll just put in Barry maybe. Okay, so now we've got a couple of employee documents. Actually, there was a student who graduated from the program last year who's now Rebecca, she's a project manager at Gooder Marketing. So now that our application is running, if I go to localhost 3000, so my app is running in my console, my terminal. So we want to replace this hard-coded list. Instead of showing these 4 employees that we just entered into our controller last week, let's replace this by querying the employers collection and showing our employers here. So how do we do this? Well, we've got our model set up. We now need to link it into our employers controller, and then we can use our model to query the database. So let's open up our employers controller. So under controllers, there's our employers.js. So we want to import the employer model so that we can do CRUD operations. So I'm going to link to the employer model that we just created. I'm going to let's take out this array of mock data that we hard-coded. And because our model, it's a Mongoose model, what this means is it has built-in methods for doing create, read, update, and delete. And we don't need to use any SQL commands either. So very similar to the way our dbset objects in ASP.NET had those built-in methods like find and add and remove. So we will use the Mongoose model to query the list of employers in MongoDB. So we'll just call employer, it's got a find method. And we can see there's a whole pile of different find methods. If we call find, just the base find, this just does a query, gets any matching documents. We can find by a specific ID, find and delete, find and update, or find one based on, let's say, like the name. This would find a single document. We don't want any parameters, no filters. We want to get all of the documents from the employer's collection. So we just call find here. And so this is going to run a database query. So when we call this query, one of 2 things can happen, right? We're going to use a callback, creates a find query that gets a list of documents. So what are the 2 possible things that might happen when we try to query the database? One result is good, one result is bad. What are the 2 possibilities that could happen when we run this query? we've got to set up two parameters when we use this find method. Each parameter represents one of the potential outcomes of our search query. What could happen? Okay, yeah, it might work properly and retrieve the data. Yep, that's one possibility. Or what's the other possibility? It might not. So whenever when we call one of these database operations using Mongoose, we typically check, did it work or did it not? So we have two callback parameters. The first callback parameter is an error, and the second callback parameter will be a response or some data. So we're going to use our callback syntax. So all Mongoose methods return either an error or usually some data. So if we get an error, we will just console.log the error. Otherwise, if we get no error, but we get back some data, I'm going to move this res.render statement inside the else. So if our query succeeds, we're going to get back a list of employers. And if we do get a list of employers, we're going to load the index view, and we are going to pass the data as a JSON object. As part of this JSON object, we're passing it to the view. So we've added a reference to our model, and we've used the model. We've called the built-in find method to query the database and determine, did our query return an error or did it return data? If we've got data, we're passing that data to our view. So if I go back and refresh my employers page, instead of those 4 hard-coded employers, Tesla, RBC, and Amazon, and whatever the other one we had is, it should now show, hopefully, okay, it does not. So let's see. Let's see why. The issue may be in our view. Go to employers index. Okay, we have our loop. Why didn't this work? We'll just check our console. I have an idea what might be wrong. Let's just see if there's anything here. Okay. That's just a missing favorite icon. We're not worried about that. So we didn't get any errors, which is good. Okay, so to debug this, maybe what I'll do in here before my res.render, so let's console.log. Let's see what this employer data looks like. We may have to modify something in our database connection. That may be the issue. But we shall see. It says our database connection is working. Oh, I think I know what the problem is. Here's why. We're using the wrong database. The connection string we copied and pasted it's looking for a database called My First Database. We created the database in the MongoDB portal, right? I called the database Comp2106. So we changed our username and password in our app.js, but this connection string is using here, right after this slash, I've highlighted, it says My First Database. I need to replace that with my own database name. So my connection's working, but it's querying a database that doesn't exist. So there's no data in there. So rename in between the slash and the question mark, we will need to rename that database. I think that should fix our problem. There we go. So now our query results are showing up. If I want to go and insert one more document and refresh, I could do that as well. I'll go back to MongoDB. I'll put in one more local web company, which is Pavlik's. They're also in Barrie. And I'll insert that document. So now I've got 3 records. And if I refresh my page, my data's up to date. Okay, so this was the step that I missed. Forgot to change my database name in my connection string. I can take out this console log in the controller. That was just there for debugging. Okay, so we can read data successfully. We might reformat this a little bit as well. Maybe in our employers index, maybe instead of a UL, maybe we want something like, maybe we want to format these as Bootstrap Cards, for example. Okay, so if we could do something like this. If I used card, oops, I guess that my card should go inside my loop. And then instead of an LI here, we could use like a card heading and card. Let's see what classes we've got. We've got card body, card title, and card text. Okay. Just experiment with this a little bit. So card body. Oh, they put it in as an H5. Sure. So let's display the employer name in this card title. And this might be and we could show the location. We'll probably do some more formatting with this to see how that looks. and not bad. We could do more with it. We'll do some more formatting later. Maybe put them in cards. Right now they're taking up the full screen, which I don't want. So I probably want like rows of maybe 3 cards. Which could figure out. I think if I did call 4. I'll have to play around with the CSS a bit more if I want them in a row. We could play around with the formatting. We could add a font. I'm going to do one other CSS thing because it's bugging me. The margin in our default style sheet is 50 pixels, which means our nav bar is not up at the top of the page. In our style sheet that the Express generator gave, I'm going to take out that padding. I want my nav bar anchored right up at the top left of the screen. If I refresh, it moves it up. And maybe just a little padding around this main section to move it over. In our layout file, if I wrap this body in a main tag, I could give it a class of container. That'll add some padding. So my nav bar is anchored top and left, but my page content has a little bit of padding, at least. So I'm going to push this code up to GitHub. For today, my connection string lives in app.js. That's not a great idea. We'll fix that next week and move it to a configuration file. And then now that my continuous deployment is set up in Heroku, once I push these changes to GitHub, I should be able to go back and refresh, and our live site should be using our database as well. So I will just make a new window down here, add my files. So this is lesson 5, read data with Mongoose. I'll push those changes, and then the continuous deployment is already configured from Heroku. So if I'll give this a minute, and if I go to the activity section in Heroku, you can see it's now automatically it's building again. So it's grabbing my new version from GitHub. And as soon as this is done, okay, it says it was deployed. It actually shows me the differences. Right, I can see what files were changed. So this was the initial version. I'll leave it open. I'll just go to a new tab. And now our live site is using our MongoDB. It's reading data using our connection and our Mongoose model. Okay, so we've connected to MongoDB, and at least we can read data. So where we'll go with this next week is we will want to be able to obviously add, edit, and delete employers through the web application, where we'll build form for adding and editing. We'll also fix up the layout and design a bit. Okay, so everything is on GitHub. So if you're watching the video, I want you to make sure you go through, like today's class is really important because you're going to need the database. to do the next at least 5 or 6 lessons. So please watch the video, get your database set up, get your application connected so that we can read data from the database, so that we can continue on to add, edit, and delete next week and potentially even in the next week's class.